Hi, I have the pleasure of introducing my dear friend and our dear friend, Becca Tarnas. She will be presenting on her work with the Red Book and the Red Book, Jung's Red Book and Tolkien's Red Book. What I would like to share about Becca right now is that we befriend people, and we, in this community, as well as engaging in the gift of friendship and all of that brings. Our friends in this community tend to teach us pretty profound ways and different ways that we can adopt and integrate in of seeing the world and seeing each other and seeing life. So what Becca has taught me, and one of the things I admire very much about her, is that she has an eye for story, and because she has an eye for story, she is one of the most teaching embodiments to me of what the archetypal eye is. Becca has this tremendous ability that I think she's had her whole life in her being, of recognizing the stories that are happening in her life and in the lives of the people she loves and who are around her and in our world. And she has this amazing ability to be able to track and kind of like see the archetypal ins and outs and happenings of what's happening in our world and in our lives. And so she has brought that great gift to some of her passions, including Tolkien, and in what she is seeing in some of the work of these two prolific writers of our time. She does it with great grace and great beauty, and it is my honor to be able to introduce my dear friend, Becca Tarnas.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to be up front and say I've been feeling the Saturn-Neptune themes really strongly all day, and especially as it came through Jess's talk and Lydia's and Travis's. So I'm just going to say I'm in this really kind of raw emotional space that's not tied to any particular reason, but that's the voice I'm going to be speaking with. And we've been honoring these two archetypes, Saturn and Neptune, particularly today, but especially in the last few months, and they're coming in stronger and stronger. And Travis really spoke to Saturn, and I'm now going to turn a little more toward Neptune and the imagination, fantasy, enchantment. To give birth to the ancient in a new time is creation. The task is to give birth to the old in a new time. Carl Gustav Jung. Fantasy remains a human right. We make in our measure and in our derivative mode because we are made. And not only made, but made in the image and likeness of a maker. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. So this project began a year ago at Esalen. I was talking to Jake in the lodge, and Jake Sherman, and I was just marveling at how Jung's Red Book really reminded me of, it felt like something out of Tolkien's world. And for those of you who know The Lord of the Rings, who know Middle-earth, there's a certain quality to that realm that it's hard to put into words. It's this tangible feeling. And when I looked at Jung's Red Book for the first time, with its red covers and the black writing with the red letters and the illustrations, I was like, this feels familiar. And Tolkien's world, Tolkien's work has been a part of my life since my childhood, and it's deeply familiar. And to find that familiar resonance looking at Jung's Red Book, I wondered why that was. And I couldn't help but notice the synchronicity that Jung called the Red Book, or the Liber Novus, the Red Book, and that Tolkien, within the context of his stories of Middle-earth, called what are published as The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings the Red Book of Westmarch. And it's a story that within the context of that world is passed on. It's written by the principal characters, Bilbo and Frodo and Sam, and that book is passed down generation to generation, the name The Red Book. And the way Tolkien presents himself, not as the author of this work, but actually as the finder and translator of it. And so I found it kind of interesting that there was a red book and a red book. And really just following an intuition, I thought, I wonder if there's anything else similar between them. And I didn't expect to find anything, but I wanted to seek that out. And I'm going to say now that my background is in Tolkien. My background isn't in Jung as much. I don't have a depth psychological perspective in the way that people who go through the depth psychology program at Pacifica, for example, do, or even many of you here who have read much more Jung than I have. So I'm just going to say that from the beginning. I'm not an expert on Jung, but I have read the Red Book now, cover to cover, which is quite an experience. So what do these two men have in common? This isn't a talk about smoking. So on the one hand, we have Jung. He's born in 1875. He's one of the founders of depth psychology, an explorer of the unconscious, the archetypal, synchronicity. He's from Switzerland. On the other hand, we have Tolkien. He's younger. He's born in 1892. He's English, firmly English. He's a philologist, meaning a lover of language. He's, of course, the famous author of The Lord of the Rings. In many ways considered the founder of the fantasy genre of fantasy literature. So you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be too much in common in what they're doing. And if you look at the product, the exoteric product of what they've given to the world, it seems radically different: depth psychology, fantasy fiction. But I wanted to keep exploring this. And so what this presentation is, it's just a taste of what I found. And it was hard to leave things out, and there's so much more that I would love to be able to share with you, but I'm just going to touch on some of these things that came through. And so we're going to be going on a journey through art and language, story, and just looking at what synchronicities emerged of these images and experiences between these two men, and kind of bringing them into dialogue with each other. Because of that, at times I'm going to read quotes that are a little longer than I normally would in this kind of presentation, but I feel like it's important for the words of these actual men to come through so you can see what is in their language. So the time period, this was the first synchronicity I found, the time period when Jung was creating the Red Book. Beginning in 1913, he started to have visions, active imagination come through him, where in a way he was in control of the situation, in a way he wasn't, and he wondered if he was going crazy. And this period, what's called the Red Book period, lasted from 1913 until 1930. But really the visions were coming through from about late 1913 until about 1917. Now it happens right at the same time. Tolkien, who's younger, he's at late teens, early 20s, in 1912, 1913, created a little book that he called the Book of Ishness. And that book has no words in it. It's only illustrations. And we don't know Tolkien as an illustrator, but it was this time when particular visions were coming through him, and he drew them right at the same time that Jung was starting to have these visions come through. And it was also at that time that Tolkien started writing what he titled The Book of Lost Tales, that was the beginning of his mythology of Middle-earth, that it led to the writing of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So 1914 is when that started. And while in the 19-teens, it was like this seminal period of imagination for both of them, they each spent the next 40 years unpacking, developing what came through in that time period, through those preliminary visions. So Jung said of this time, when the Red Book imaginings were coming through, the years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious, and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work. Now, there is a correlation astrologically with this time period, but I'm not going to get into it that much. I'm going to just mention that there was a Uranus-Neptune opposition, and there's really interesting correlations between the Uranus-Neptune quadrature alignments and both Jung and Tolkien's work. But I'm going to save that maybe for our discussion or for later, just because I really want to get to the actual material. And another reason is because, well, everything that I'm presenting expresses the archetypal character of Uranus and Neptune. We've been hearing Neptune talked about all day, of enchantment, imagination, fantasy, soul, spirit, psyche. And Uranus, it liberates and awakens that. All of what I'm going to show you reflects that archetypal nature. But there's something else coming through both of these men that is even more detailed than, archetypally detailed than that larger framework holds. But there's something even more specific in these synchronicities. So both men had a sense that they weren't living in the right time, or that they felt split. Jung felt like he was living in two centuries. He described it as number one and number two personalities. Number one lived in the current time, and number two was ancient, connected to the Middle Ages. He said he lived in God's world, an eternal world. And Tolkien also felt that he was living in the wrong time, that he wasn't a modern. He was drawn only to pre-Chaucerian literature. He understood ancient languages as if they were his own, like Anglo-Saxon and Gothic and Old Icelandic and several other languages that are no longer spoken on Earth. So there's this sense of not quite being in the right time for both of them. They both began their artistic careers, you could say. Neither of them are known as painters, but began their artistic careers by doing paintings of landscapes and or drawings of landscapes. And then for both Jung and Tolkien, about in the early 1910s onward, there was an abrupt shift in the style of their artwork, from representational landscapes to abstract, semi-figurative images, imaginal images, visionary artwork. Right at the beginning of this time, 1913, Jung had a vision, and it's called, some refer to it as his flood vision. And the first time it came through was October 17th of 1913. He was on a train. And I'll read it in his words. He said, "In October, while I was alone on a journey, I was suddenly seized by an overpowering vision. I saw a monstrous flood covering all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. I saw the mighty yellow waves, the floating rubble of civilization, and the drowned bodies of uncounted thousands. Then the whole sea turned to blood. 2 weeks later, he had the vision again, accompanied by a voice saying, 'Look at it well. It is wholly real, and it will be so. You cannot doubt it.' It so happens that a vision of a flood, of a great wave, also was coming to Tolkien, and it came to him recurrently, often in his dreams, but sometimes while awake, beginning actually around age 7 for him. And it continued throughout his life, actually until he put it into his stories. And he called it his Atlantis haunting. And in Tolkien's words, he says, "This legend or myth or dim memory of some ancient history has always troubled me. In sleep, I had the dreadful dream of the ineluctable wave, either coming out of the quiet sea or coming in towering over the green inlands. It still occurs occasionally, though now exorcised by writing about it. It always ends by surrender, and I wake gasping out of deep water." For Jung, he came to realize a few months after this vision first came to him that it was prophetic of World War I, the flood of death sweeping over the European continent. And Tolkien, being a younger man and English, actually fought in that war. And it deeply influenced his life and writing and his imagination. So the first vision that came to after that, the first of the Red Book visions that came to Jung also came before World War I, right about the same time as the Great Wave vision. And I'd like to read it to you and just listen or allow the images to arise in you. Pay attention to what colors come forward and just allow yourself to be steeped in his words. It was during Advent of the year 1913, December 12th to be exact, that I resolved upon the decisive step. I was sitting at my desk once more, thinking over my fears. Then I let myself drop. Suddenly, it was as though the ground literally gave way beneath my feet, and I plunged down into dark depths. I could not fend off the feeling of panic. And then, abruptly, at not too great a depth, I landed on my feet in a soft, sticky mass. I felt great relief, although I was apparently in complete darkness. After a while, my eyes grew accustomed to the gloom, which was rather like a deep twilight. Before me was the entrance to a dark cave, in which stood a dwarf with a leathery skin, as if he were mummified. I squeezed past him through the narrow entrance and waded knee-deep through icy water to the other end of the cave where, on a projecting rock, I saw a glowing red crystal. I grasped the stone, lifted it, and discovered a hollow underneath. At first, I could make out nothing, but then I saw that there was running water. In it, a corpse floated by, a youth with blonde hair and a wound in his head. He was followed by a gigantic black scarab, and then by a red newborn sun, rising up out of the depths of the water. Dazzled by the light, I wanted to replace the stone upon the opening, but then a fluid welled out. It was blood. A thick jet of it leapt up, and I felt nauseated. It seemed to me that the red blood continued to spurt for an unendurably long time. At last it ceased, and the vision came to an end. At the same time that Jung was having this vision, this underworld vision, and of darkness, of redness, of going into the underworld, Tolkien did this drawing, and it was the first drawing in the Book of Ishnis. And there's no explanation at all, except the title, Before. And the Jungian and Tolkien scholar Lance Owens has described this as it's primitive, it's quick, it's a statement of the deep dream world. The Tolkien scholar Verlyn Flieger says that the title Before conveys the dual notions of standing in front of and awaiting or anticipating. The sketch is remarkable for its mood, which conveys both foreboding, the dark corridor, and hope, the lighted doorway. I don't know about you, but that doorway doesn't give me a lot of hope. So I'm going to disagree with her there. But both of them seem to be having these visions of going down into the darkness and encountering a threshold of some kind. And this, for Tolkien, is followed by another image called Afterwards. Again, no explanation except the title, coming through on the other side. And yet it still appears to be on this underworld, underground journey. And throughout Tolkien's stories, for those of you who know them, there are many underworld, underground journeys. Moria, where the wizard Gandalf loses his life, or loses one of his lives. Shelob's Tunnel, where the great spider is encountered. And doesn't that sound a little like the giant scarab that we just read in Jung's vision? the paths of the dead that Aragorn and his host pass through, where they encounter hosts of the dead. And in the Red Book, Jung also encounters hosts of the dead who speak to him. The encounter with Gollum on an island underground surrounded by water, just like in Jung's vision. There is a lake, it is underground, and while in Jung's there is this precious red jewel, what is on that island in Tolkien's world but the ring? These objects of power. And then also in Tolkien's stories, the underground encounter with Smaug, the dragon. We meet the dragon in the underworld in so many of these kinds of stories, and that is carried in both Jung and Tolkien's work. So this is my favorite drawing out of the Book of Ishness. It's called The End of the World, which could have many meanings. Tolkien at this time moved from what he saw on the outside to what he was seeing on the inside. And what he called the earliest Ishnesses were symbolic or abstract images from the imagination. And he did 20 of these visionary paintings from 1911 to the summer of 1913. Now, the end of the world, it's not coming through as clearly as I'd like. The end of the world is this image of someone on a threshold at the world's end. And yet, again, as Lance Owen says, when looking at this image, that fellow isn't jumping. That fellow has stepped. He is not falling. He is walking into a sun, into a moon, into stars. He has crossed a threshold and is entering the imaginal, and he is risking his life, he's risking his sanity to do that. And in many ways, that is what Jung was doing as well, as he stepped into the imaginal, going into the Red Book period. I can just show you a few more of Tolkien's Ishnesses. Wickedness, eeriness. Doesn't that look like a wizard? Oh my gosh. Thought, undertenishness. So, I briefly want to define what fantasy is for both of these men, because they both give a definition to it. And Jung described fantasy as a flow or aggregate of images and ideas in the unconscious psyche, constituting its most characteristic activity, to be distinguished from thought or cognition. Active fantasies, on the other hand, so what he was doing in the Red Book, in his Red Book period, do require assistance from the ego for them to emerge into consciousness. When that occurs, we have a fusion of the conscious and unconscious areas of the psyche, an expression of the psychological unity of the person. Now, for Tolkien, he describes fantasy as the making or glimpsing of other worlds. It's what is at the heart of the desire, the heart of the desire of fairy. And I'm not going to unpack this too much now, but fairy is Tolkien's word for the realm of imagination that he feels one has access to through the imaginal process. Fantasy is a natural human activity, Tolkien says. It certainly does not destroy or even insult reason, and it does not either blunt the appetite for nor obscure the perception of scientific verity. Fantasy is a rational, not an irrational activity. So keeping those definitions in mind as we now turn more to Jung's Red Book, and we can see that just the similarity of some of the material that they were coming back with from the imagination, from fairy. So they're both encountering dragons in these realms. You can see Jung's, Tolkien's. Here's another one. They were both encountering these kind of strange trees of life. The tree of Amalion that you see on the left, Tolkien drew regularly according to his biographer. This one happens to be from August of 1928, so the end of their overlapping Red Book periods. And Jung said of trees in particular, this is from the Red Book, trees in particular were mysterious and seemed to me direct embodiments of the incomprehensible meaning of life. For that reason, the woods were the places where I felt closest to its deepest meaning and to its awe-inspiring workings. And trees were beloved, even sacred, to Tolkien. He liked most of all to be with trees. He liked to climb them, to lean against them. He even liked to talk to them. And for those of you who know his stories, Ents are walking, talking trees, and so we get to have these conversations with trees. He kind of liked trees more than people sometimes. And of course, the entrance to fairy, both for Tolkien and in many fairy stories, lay not underground, but through the woods. One passes through that blurred threshold of the woods and enters into the realm of fairy. And of course, trees are significant in many of the world's mythologies. We have the world tree, which Jung painted here. And then at the heart of Tolkien's cosmology, you have what are called the two trees of Valinor. And at the center of his world is not one world tree, but two. Now here's an image that blew me away when I found it. So on the left, we have Tolkien's illustration of the Eye of Sauron, the eye of the evil being in the world of Middle-earth. And on the right, we have a very similar illustration that is without explanation in the Red Book. And so I just thought that's kind of an interesting artistic synchronicity. But then as I was reading the Red Book, I found another interesting parallel. First, I'm going to read to you Tolkien's description of the Eye of Sauron. And this is from, for those of you who know the story, this moment when Frodo is looking into the mirror of Galadriel and a vision comes to him. But suddenly the mirror went altogether dark as if a hole had opened in the world of sight, and Frodo looked into emptiness. In the black abyss there appeared a single eye that slowly grew until it filled nearly all the mirror. So terrible was it that Frodo stood rooted, unable to cry out or to withdraw his gaze. The eye was rimmed with fire, but was itself glazed, yellow as a cat's, watchful and intent, and the black slit of its pupil opened on a pit, a window into nothing. Now in the Red Book, in Jung's Red Book, he writes, "Nothing is more valuable to the evil one than his eye, since only through his eye can emptiness seize gleaming fullness. Because the emptiness lacks fullness, it craves fullness and its shining power, and it drinks it in by means of its eye, which is able to grasp the beauty and unsullied radiance of fullness. The emptiness is poor, and if it lacked its eye, it would be hopeless. It sees the most beautiful and wants to devour it in order to spoil it." So there's this strange synchronicity, yet again, of evil and the eye, the single eye that devours. So I'm just approaching the end here, but I want to show you a few more interesting images. For those of you who know Jung's work, you know how important the image of the mandala is, and how it's a symbol of the self. Formation, transformation, the eternal mind's eternal recreation. And these are several drawings of mandalas from throughout the Red Book. And I didn't expect to find mandalas in Tolkien's artwork, and yet I did. And he would draw these inexplicably, and then he would assign them to people's characters, and so they were also symbols of individuals, symbols of self within his stories. And I'll just mention this briefly. Some of Tolkien's drawings, they don't look like mandalas, but something that Sean pointed out to me is a lot of them have this kind of central axis. This is the original cover of The Hobbit. You can see this kind of central axis here and here. So picture yourself floating up above it, and suddenly you have this mandalic shape. And here's another one of Tolkien's drawings that has this kind of mandalic shape to it. So all of these, what are they? They're symbols. They're archetypes coming through. And that is what story carries. It carries the symbolic, carries the imagination. A symbol is something that transcends time and conflict, and yet it's common to both. And like the transcendent function in Jung's psychology, it offers a new synthesis. It's a bridge between the conscious and unconscious. Jung writes in the Red Book, "The symbol is the word that goes out of the mouth, that one does not simply speak, but that rises out of the depths of the self as a word of power and great need and places itself unexpectedly on the tongue. If one accepts the symbol, it is as if a door opens, leading into a new room whose existence one previously did not know." And Tolkien wrote kind of similar statement about story. He said, "Such stories open a door on other time. And if we pass through, though only for a moment, we stand outside of our own time, outside time itself, maybe." So some of what I started to feel as I was looking at these different correlations between images and other passages throughout Jung's Red Book and Tolkien's stories, and we can talk more later in person about what some of those other synchronicities are. What I started to feel is that both Jung and Tolkien were somehow entering into the same place. It felt like a realm to me, that they were going into and encountering these beings, these places, and coming back with surprisingly similar images and stories. And it is a place that is both inner and it's outer. And I believe that imagination maybe isn't actually a human capacity. It's a realm that all of us have access to, that we can all enter into. Maybe that's also the realm of the archetypal, and that we can access that through symbol, through story, but we can also go there and we can find and bring back symbol and story that helps us lead others into that realm. So ways that they can inform each other's work. Jung's advice was to everyone, make your own Red Book and return to it like a sanctuary or a cathedral, because your soul is within its pages. And Tolkien's Red Book, his story, is what he gave to the world in the form of the Lord of the Rings. It's a text that's treated by many as a sacred text. I've been amazed at the conversations I've had with people around the impact that one story had on their life and how they return to it again and again. There's people who read it once a year. And both of these books, they're invitations to enter into imagination. So I'll just end with this brief quote from Jung, which is, "What was most essential was not interpreting or understanding the fantasies, but experiencing them." So I call all of you to experience your own fantasies, your own images, your own pathway to imagination. Thanks. I think I used up more than all of my time, but I'm happy to talk to anyone who'd like to afterwards.